Hi, my name is Jamie Crawley, and I'm the current president of the Austin Soccer Foundation. We're pleased to join each of you today as a supporting sponsor of the first annual Texas Soccer Summit organized by the Striker. Our charitable organization is a 501c3 nonprofit that serves to make a difference in our community through inclusive, equitable support and initiatives based on our love of the beautiful game. Here is Catalina Berry, one of our board members, to share a little more about the Austin Soccer Foundation.
Thank you, Jamie. The Austin Soccer Foundation is celebrating its 6th anniversary this month. It has been our pleasure to support the underserved and economically disadvantaged soccer community in Austin and surrounding areas through academic advancement, player and field development, and referee development. We have been fortunate to distribute an excess of $30,000 in academic scholarships to 16 graduating seniors as they have embarked on their post-high school journeys, and we continue to grow this initiative. In the area of player and field development, we have donated goals, equipment, and uniforms, and we provided consulting to help establish the Texas School for the Deaf's girls soccer team. We also funded a futsal court for the Montopolis Idea School and have donated to Austin Independent School District Athletics, benefiting 72 boys and girls middle school soccer teams and over 920 soccer players. We've also collected and distributed gently used soccer boots through our annual support of Austin's Refugee Day Festival with our community partners, the Central Texas Red Cross. And despite the pandemic, we continue to work closely with our advisory board member, 2020 MLS Referee of the Year, Ismail Elfath, to develop and support an inclusive and equitable opportunity for referees through the support of equipment, clinics, and leadership development. We also had the opportunity to host a Facebook Live conversation with him and legends Landon Donovan and Howard Webb this past April of 2020. As we continue to make a difference in the community through our love of the beautiful game, we seek and partner with like-minded organizations to collaborate with, including the 4ATX Foundation of Austin FC, as well as supporters groups Austin Anthem, Los Verdes, La 512, and Austin's American Outlaws, just to name a few. Please follow us on social media and find out how you can be part of and contribute to our charitable efforts giving back to our community through the beautiful game.
Hi everyone, welcome in to the special panel for today, Saturday, the final day of the Texas Soccer Summit. I'm John Arnold. I'm excited to be hosting this panel today on keeping the stories of Texas's greats alive. We're going to be talking a bit about soccer history in the state and the fact that soccer doesn't simply go back to 1996 when MLS was founded or even the glory days of the NASL, but much further. We're going to discuss the origins of the game in our state and also talk about how it's evolved, how it's developed, and some of the greats that have trod on the fields in our state or are born here and raised here that maybe have been a bit forgotten or we don't talk about enough. I'm excited to be joined by a fantastic and extremely knowledgeable panel. The cliche about having forgotten more of something than I even know is absolutely true with this group. First joining us in Michigan is Josh Hakala. He maintains the Cup.us, a fantastic site that's now old enough to vote. It's 18 this year, Josh, so I don't know if it's going to be casting any ballots, but an incredibly long-running site tracking U.S. Open Cup history. Josh, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm actually, it's voting age for my site. Eventually, we will track down all of the U.S. Open Cup's history, although it dates back to 1913. So we still have a lot of work to do, but that's the goal of it.
Yeah, the site could vote, soon it could drink, but the U.S. Open Cup itself, a century-long history. It's a bit harder to track. Also joining us is Jeff Organ. He runs the Texas Soccer Journal. He's at Tex Soccer Journal on Twitter, TX Soccer Journal, a soccer historian who runs the titular Texas Soccer Journal. He has a great interview series coming up this year called the Texas Soccer Leader Interview Series, and also has all sorts of things on his site relating to modern and past soccer in Texas. Jeff, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be invited, John. I'm very happy that the Striker Texas has gotten started and look forward to working very closely with you to continue to expand and grow the game in the state.
Absolutely. We're excited as well, and also excited to have Dave Brett Wasser joining us, Austin resident who is who is the foremost archivist of American soccer video. Dave Brett, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You can find Dave Brett on Twitter at DaveBrett88 for more of his thoughts and sometimes some great videos. He just posted one here in Texas decades ago. It was a Texas Stadium NASL game, Tornado Cosmos. Is that right, Dave Brett?
Right, that's right. Played at the home of the Cowboys and unfortunately played over American football grid lines. Back then, they often had to do that.
We're still dealing with some of that today.
Very rarely. When was the last time you
That's
saw an MLS
true.
match played over football grid lines? It almost never happens. Yeah.
Well, at Toyota Stadium now and then, when it's playoff season or when the Frisco teams are around, sometimes they do a great job up there. They do a great job, Alan Reed and his groundskeeping crew. But sometimes you can see the lines, especially on TV. In person, it isn't usually as bad, but I'm sure the TV lines at Texas Stadium make it an interesting watch for that game. But as I mentioned, you can check that out on YouTube. Well, as we said, we're talking about the depth of history that soccer has in Texas and the United States. And it certainly didn't begin in 1996. It certainly didn't begin in the 70s. Jeff, you gave a fantastic chat to the, correct me if I'm wrong, the Society of American Soccer History, SASH?
Yes.
And you chatted about kind of discovering the origins of soccer in Texas and how deep they go back, all the way back to the 1800s. Tell us more about that, Jeff.
The first reference that I could find in the newspaper archives to soccer in Texas goes back to 1873 in Galveston. And you would expect that Galveston would be the place you would find that because virtually most immigrants and everybody else that came into the state, at least the southern part of the state, came through that port back in the days. And the thing that was most fascinating about it was that, number one, it's a little bit difficult, particularly in the early years, to sort out the difference between soccer and American football. Because if you look at the history of the sport back in those days, football and rugby and soccer, all three of them were kind of merged together. And in many cases, I found situations where it seemed like some conglomeration of all three of them were being played at the same time. But in any event, the first reference that I saw to it was in 1873, and it was a church picnic in Galveston. And a team of people, I guess, people that were part of the church, put two teams together and played a game as part of that picnic. And the thing that got me wondering was that, number one, they could find enough people that actually knew what they were doing to be able to do it in 1873. And that, number two, the way the newspaper positioned it is if everybody knew what football was. So it was clear that a lot of the immigrants and a lot of the ships that were coming in were bringing the sport to the community. And that was the first time I found it. One other thing I want to quickly reference too is that it seemed to have spread rather quickly, actually, from Galveston to other parts of southern Texas. And the most interesting reference I found was in 1876 in a seminary school in what is now a ghost town outside of Brenham, which is about halfway between Houston and Austin on the main road, or one of the main roads going between those two communities. There was a girls' team that was founded at that seminary school. And this newspaper article pointed out that they had challenged the freshman boys team to a game and that the boys didn't want to play them. So that shows that not only did it spread, 150 miles away from Galveston within the space of 3 years, but also that it wasn't just a boys or a men's thing at that point.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting. It does seem, Jeff, to have taken a while for then there to become these like organized teams, right? I think you found a sort of a league in San Antonio that formed around the 50s, but it does seem like there's a bit of a gap from, hey, soccer exists, the sport is here, this seminary team is challenging the girls team, the girls team is challenging the freshmen, and hey, it's named teams. Ooh, new panelist. But Jeff, can you tell us more about kind of the organization?
Yeah, actually, in fact, San Antonio is the place where it really first got started. And it actually was 1950. It was 1900. The team, there was a team that was actually called, coincidentally, San Antonio Football Club, which is the same name as the team that is playing in the USL right now, but football was spelled differently. And they've had their first organization meeting in 1901. I had seen references to soccer in San Antonio in the 1800s. Generally, they would play games around Thanksgiving, but there was a concerted effort in the early 1900s to get a league started in San Antonio. And it took a couple of years, but they have actually formed what was called the Alamo City Football Association. And it consisted of three teams. San Antonio FC, the Mission Athletic Club, and what was called the high school team. And I'm not sure whether that was actually high school kids or teams that were playing under the, adults that were playing under the high school moniker. But they actually did make an effort, the San Antonio Football Club, to reach out to schools back in those days in 1901, 1902, to begin to teach people how to play the sport there. And so the time that league got together as an entity was in 1903, and they played together. Unfortunately, they weren't able to put together a whole lot more teams to play in that league. And what happened was that American football took over the city. And as I found in my research, around 1904, the Mission Athletic Club sent a team up to Austin to play using rugby rules. And they got killed by the Austin team, which I think was essentially a University of Texas football team. And the University of Texas actually came down a few months later to play in San Antonio using rugby rules. And they had hundreds of people that showed up for the game. Traveling supporters from Austin came down, maybe the first traveling supporters group in Texas, bringing horns and kazoos and other noisemakers. And it took the city by storm. And what ended up happening was they had a meeting in 1905 where they had 6 teams that were lined up to play in the new league. And the only question they had was whether they were going to play by rugby rules or soccer rules. And rugby rules won. And unfortunately, they came up with some interesting reasons why. The newspapers talked about how the rugby supporters were saying it is the only game that can be played. And then they also made the rather dubious response that it was safer than soccer. And so that was it. And for all intents and purposes, soccer continued to operate under the radar for a number of years throughout South Texas in both the Houston area, with one exception, which was Galveston, where they really made a significant effort after they rebuilt from the tremendous hurricane to build a league, a club, a youth club, all kinds of things. And there was a club called the Pirate Soccer Team of Galveston, Pirate Soccer Club of Galveston, that was probably the first Texas super team. They dominated in the 1920s in the state. But otherwise, everything else was pretty hit and miss. And what I found was there were constant efforts to reorganize all over the state to get the sport going. But if you remember what Texas was like back in those days, everything was Southwestern Conference football. And everything else, I think, except for possibly minor league baseball, really struggled to get anything going.
It's interesting that some of the struggles that we still talk about today, I hosted a panel yesterday that people can watch on the archive and on the Striker YouTube page, asking about, are marketers still focused on getting people away from American football? Is that the right approach? There was a great discussion, lasted about an hour. You can check it out. But it's fascinating to hear that these problems are certainly nothing new. As we kind of keep going along the evolution of the game, Jay Brett, obviously the NASL was such a critical moment, league for the United States, for the growth of the sport. For those of us who are not old enough to remember the NASL and can only see it through your archive and other clips, can you kind of take us through the teams that were in Texas and the influence that they had in their respective markets?
Well, sure. The NASL started in 1967. 1966 was the first time a World Cup finals match was shown in the United States. It was the World Cup final that year that England won. And it was at a time, the 1960s, where there was a lot of growth in professional sports in America outside of soccer. I mean, that was the time when the AFL was challenging the NFL. And so a bunch of sports entrepreneurs, including Lamar Hunt, whose name now is on the U.S. Open Cup, decided that America was ready for a soccer league. The early years of the NASL were a real struggle. First of all, there were no American players, so all of the players had to be imported from Europe. They took actual entire teams from Europe and had them play here in what was their off-season. And in the early years of the NASL, crowds were small. The NASL almost went out of business at one point in 69, 70. They were almost down to, I think, only 5 or 6 teams. But Lamar Hunt and a few other people stuck with it. And gradually throughout the 1970s, it got more and more popular. And then, of course, Pele came in 1975, and that was a huge publicity coup. And for a time in the late 1970s, soccer was huge in America. I mean, I grew up in New York City. I grew up a New York Cosmos fan. And in the days, the late 1970s, the New York Mets were struggling at the gate. They would get maybe 10,000 fans a game. Cosmos were routinely drawing 50,000 fans. And at the time, people thought, well, look, soccer's going to take over. There's an old clip of Howard Cosell at that era saying that it's only a matter of time before soccer becomes the most popular sport in America. Well, I suppose he could be right. Maybe 100 years from now it will, but he isn't right yet. And the NASL, of course, another thing about the NASL is that it came along at a time, before the explosion of cable television and satellite television provided the American people with access to foreign leagues. So for years, the 1970s and even in the early 1980s, American soccer was the only soccer you could watch in America. There was one show, there was a show called Soccer Made in Germany on PBS stations, strangely enough, which showed edited, tape-delayed broadcasts of German soccer matches. But other than that, it was slim pickings. I mean, I'm always amazed. I mean, we talk about the biggest change in soccer in my lifetime. I mean, when I was growing up, you would get maybe one soccer match on television a week. Maybe if you were lucky, you got two. Compared to today, when there's, how many different, I've lost track of how many different channels are showing soccer on my cable television. No. I mean, you could probably watch at least a dozen games. You couldn't probably watch all of the games on television. Even if you did nothing but watch soccer all day, you still couldn't see all the soccer that is televised because you can't watch more than one game at a time. So it's the NASL was the catalyst for soccer in America, and it didn't last for a variety of different reasons. They had a bad business plan. They did not have a salary cap. They were playing in leased stadiums that were not designed for the sport. They were staying in cavernous baseball and football stadium. And then, maybe some other things. In the early 80s, I think there was a sort of a trend towards xenophobia, and soccer was regarded as a foreign sport. Still is to this day, to some extent. And by the way, Jeff, you were talking about the early 20th century. There's a bunch of theories about why soccer didn't catch on in America in the early 20th century. And one of the leading theories is simply this xenophobia. It was regarded as a foreign sport. And Americans preferred sports that had been invented here, like, baseball, football, and basketball. And that's always been a challenge. But yeah, the NASL, I mean, for those of us of a certain age who grew up with that league, that was the league. And the interesting thing is there was, in some respects, there's some similarity between MLS and the NASL. The NASL had some markets that were doing very well and some markets that were doing poorly. MLS, I suppose you could say, has the same problem. The difference is in the NASL, if a market was doing poorly, within a few years they moved the team out to some other city and just tried somewhere else. Right. Whereas MLS is loath to do that. Right. But and another interesting thing is that the NASL succeeded in some cities that were not successful in MLS. I mean, New York, like Tampa, was a huge market in the NASL. MLS had a team in Tampa and then took it out because they weren't doing very well. MLS has never really penetrated the New York market very well. I mean, NYCFC got some good crowds, for a while. That's taken it off. So in certain respects, the NASL was successful where MLS is not. But the main thing is that now soccer fans have so many different options, whereas during the NASL era they did not. It was really, if you wanted to watch soccer, you had to watch the NASL. And that,
absolutely.
Of course, is
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for that perspective, Dave Brett. I just want to bring in Josh to the discussion and talk about the U.S. Open Cup because it's such a significant portion of U.S. soccer history. We joked about it being more than 100 years old. That's not a joke. That's the truth. We don't see a ton of Texas teams popping up in the winners list in the final. It's really dominated by East Coast teams and Midwestern teams. So, Josh, how much do we know about Texas teams' involvement in the competition in the early days, maybe even the first half of its history?
Yeah, the first reference we have of a Texas team, and this is, with my site, like, we have the entire tournament and the entire country to cover, and so, like, we haven't, uncovered every little detail from the state of Texas, but the earliest one that we have is a club from Dallas called Alpine Sportswear SC from 1949. They're the first Texas team that we've found to take part in the tournament. They played in the Dallas County Soccer League, and they I think they were just one and done that year. In 1949, they lost to a team from St. Louis, and a lot of teams in that era, it's really tough, especially going forward. And we'll talk about this in a little bit as far as uncovering history, but there's just so little media coverage for the sport in not just Texas, but around the country. So it's really like there's a black hole of U.S. Open Cup information from the 50s up and through the 80s, really. But we've uncovered a lot of stuff from little tidbits. Like in 1980, the Texas Longhorns had their club team that entered the tournament. That club team's been around since 1964. So I imagine they had to have entered prior to 1980. Right. We just haven't found evidence of that yet. But yeah, they played against the Atlanta Wolves in 1980, and they were just, as far as we know, that's the only time we have them playing in the tournament. But the rest of them, you'll find some Houston area teams here and there. The Galveston International played in multiple tournaments through the 80s. But you're right, like the champions. I mean, we didn't get a Texas team into the U.S. Open Cup final until 1991, when the Richardson Rockets or Dallas Rockets, depending on which newspaper you're finding, made it to the championship game but fell short. But and then we had the El Paso Patriots, getting into the modern era of the tournament, got there in 1995 and lost to the Richmond Kickers on their home field. But really, it's really up until, I mentioned the 1949 team, and there's just kind of like a huge gap. There just wasn't a lot of teams that entered the tournament that we're aware of, that we've found. They certainly didn't make it. If they did enter, they didn't get beyond, they didn't get to the quarterfinals, because we've at least tracked down the quarterfinals of almost every year since 1913. So it's tough to find information about the teams, that got into the first round and maybe were one and done. But really didn't start getting teams in until, the 80s and, into the 90s. And then once the modern era started, Major League Soccer, of course, and the El Paso Patriots and a few other amateur teams got into the mix.
Yeah.
John, if I
is there any sort of reason? Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Yeah. I realize I didn't answer your specific question. You asked me about how Texas teams did in the NASL, and I didn't even bother saying. The answer is, unfortunately, Texas teams did not do that well in the NASL. Dallas Tornado won the championship in 1971 when it was a tiny league, and it was pretty much almost a semi-pro outfit at that point. Players all had other jobs because they weren't getting paid enough to play soccer. And then the Dallas Tornado ended up going out of business in 1981, 3 years before the league collapsed. They had a team in Houston for 3 years that did not do well at the Astrodome. So unfortunately, I can't really say that the NASL was successful in Texas. It was not. They had a team in San Antonio for 1 or 2 years that just collapsed. Who knows? I think maybe the reason is just that Texas historically has been a American football state, and soccer has struggled at the gate in both in the NASL, and you can almost argue in MLS as well. Dallas has not been one of the better drawing teams in MLS, and it's a win for the Hunt family. They would still be there.
Yeah. Jeff, what have you found about the maybe relative success of Texas teams? Because we're hearing Dave Brett point out that most of the NASL teams in Texas were not necessarily dynamos on or off the field, no pun intended for Houston. We're hearing Josh say it's difficult to find clubs who made deep runs in the U.S. Open Cup. Were Texas teams just bad? What happened here?
I think that there's not an easy answer to that question. And I think part of it really just has to do with Texas is a pretty insular and isolated place, in the early years in particular. One of the interesting things about the Galveston Pirates is that because they had no league to play in, their season basically consisted of playing foreign ships. That whenever a ship would come into town, they would put together a collection of sailors who would come train. And in fact, what I've learned is that they would go from city to port in the United States, playing games against, whoever they could find to play games against. So it was a pretty isolated place. And I did find a reference actually in 1927 to the Pirate Club, basically saying that they were very interested in playing in the Challenge Cup at that time, which was the predecessor, I guess, Josh, to the U.S. Open Cup. But for one reason or another, they just never put it together and never participated in that. And I think if there's any club that would have done it, it would have been them. And outside of the one tournament that the Tornado won that Dave is talking about. And by the way, I do want to mention that season, one thing that is most remarkable about it is that there was one game in the semifinals that they played against Rochester where they played 176 minutes of soccer before they had a winner. Six 15-minute overtimes. That was prior to the PKs and everything else associated with it. And to make that even more remarkable, they turned around the next game and they played 3 overtimes. And then when the first round of the finals that year, they also went into overtime. So, by the time they'd been done, they'd played like almost 600 minutes of soccer in over the space of 13 days. But other than that, there was some success. The Houston team, for example, in 1979 actually had the second best record in the league. But they blew up in the playoffs. They lost in the first round of the playoffs. And the Tornado had some success in the playoffs and everything else. But other than that, until you get to MLS with, the Houston Dynamo in 2006 and 2007, there has not been a tremendous amount of success. I guess I need to call back to the Dallas, the Dallas Burn winning the Open Cup in the I guess 1997 or 1998. But other than that, there hasn't been a lot of it. And I think part of it just has to do with the fact, as Dave pointed out, that it is still a relatively young state when you think about it, as far as soccer is concerned, because it has taken so long to gain traction. And then, and then just simply the fact that for a long, long period of time, it was a pretty insular place that was by itself.
What do you think, Josh, when you look at the broader scope and see that, it sounds like a team like Galveston Pirates, if they were not even barnstorming, if they're port storming and kind of looking for a game, wandering port to port, trying to find teams to play. And maybe they wanted to get into the Open Cup, but, weren't able to logistically make it happen. But do you have any thoughts, Josh, as we're talking about kind of why Texas teams perhaps took so long to burst onto the national scene such that they have?
I think it probably has a lot to do with a lot of the challenges we see today, which is just travel. I think getting so much of the tournament was based in the Northeast. And then, around mid 20th century, it started to get out on the West Coast in Los Angeles and San Francisco and areas like that. But to be in Texas, just if there's not enough teams in Texas alone, that's tough for any team to have to travel and try to make that happen logistically. And I couldn't even imagine, even in the 1930s, trying to get around, making cross-country trips. We've heard stories of teams from New York making trips to Chicago, and they're like, it's the longest trip in the history of the universe. How did they make such a journey all the way to Chicago? And to think that, to have a team go to Dallas or, even that far out would be just unheard of. So I imagine that was probably the biggest thing. Probably a team from Galveston or Dallas or San Antonio probably looked at it and they were like, well, we'd love to play in this tournament, but where do we have to go to play? Well, maybe Los Angeles, maybe San Francisco, maybe New York or Boston. So that's a tough sell, probably financially for a lot of teams. So I think that's probably the biggest obstacle, especially for teams. These teams were not huge money-making machines. These were many of them, especially even once we get into the 70s and 80s, and they were just semi-pro teams at best. Many of them amateur teams, so they just didn't have the funds to travel all over the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we sort of hold up Texas's kind of central location as a benefit, but when travel was so much harder, maybe it was a bit of a curse that you can't get to those East Coast pods, you can't get to those West Coast pods. If you're just joining us, we're talking about keeping the stories of Texas's greats alive on a panel that's brought to you by the Austin Soccer Foundation. The Austin Soccer Foundation is a nonprofit charity making a difference in our community through inclusive and equitable support and initiatives based on a love of the beautiful game. Connect with the Austin Soccer Foundation on Instagram and Twitter at ATX Soccer FNDN. That's ATX Soccer FNDN. Well, talking about Texas's greats, I think that a name that we all have great respect for is Lamar Hunt. His name is on the U.S. Open Cup trophy, Josh, that is the tournament you cover. And Jeff and Dave Brett, you both were able to see teams that Lamar Hunt organized and was a part of. I'm not sure who wants to start. Maybe I'll go to Josh first, to just stick with you since Lamar's name is on the trophy, and then get the Texas perspective. But, what did Lamar Hunt contribute to American soccer, and how formative was he to the growth of the game in the country?
I mean, I think it's pretty easy to say that without him, then I have a hard time imagining what soccer would be like in this country in this new modern era, or even, the attempts that were made, and then maybe you could say a foundation being built in the NASL era, was significant, but ultimately failed. But, in this trying to get it right the next time in this Major League Soccer era that we entered in, I mean, there were questions of whether or not this would hold up, in like 99, 2000, it was on kind of shaky ground. And I mean, he stuck with it, and he had Columbus and Kansas City and Dallas, and like just trying to keep things going. And I think without him, I mean, I have to imagine that he also just, with all of the other people, he obviously wasn't the only billionaire that was keeping the league afloat, but I think he had a lot of weight among the groups of billionaires that made the league what it is today. And I think he carried a lot of influence, and I think kept the league going. And it's not easy to say to somebody who has that much money, be like, hey, would you mind losing a few $1 million? I think, can we just lose a few more $1 million for a few more years? I think it'll work out in the end. It's a tough sell to somebody, and I think that without him steering the ship a little bit, owning 3 teams at various times, and I think to name the tournament after him was a pretty fitting tribute. They did that in 1999, and it was kind of like when I made the announcement, I thought, well, of course, that seems like an ideal person just from the history of the sport in this country. He's right up there on Mount Rushmore of influencers, people who have made this happen.
Dave Brett, any thoughts on Lamar?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry I never met him. I've heard so many people talk about what a nice man he was. And he has a distinction of saving not 1 but 2 soccer leagues in American history. He was instrumental in saving the NASL in 1970, 71, when it looked like it might go out of business. And then 30 years later, he was instrumental in saving MLS in around 2001, at the time when MLS contracted 2 teams. Apparently they had a meeting, and they were ready to close down the league. And he and a couple of other people said, very wealthy people, said, let's stick with it and give it a shot. And the story I love about Lamar Hunt is apparently his love of soccer started in 1966. He fell in love with his wife during the 1966 World Cup. And he said that he had always had enduring affection for his wife and soccer because he fell in love with both at the same time.
I think we can all relate to having, two kind of loves, the kind of healthy relationship that many of us are thankful for, and then the perhaps unhealthy relationship we have with the game. Jeff, your thoughts on Lamar Hunt and his influence on the game?
Well, I don't think there's any. I don't think Texas would have gotten as started early as they did without Lamar Hunt. And I think the most enduring legacy that I think people tend to overlook is there's all kinds of buzz right now about all the players that are coming out of the FC Dallas FC Dallas Academy system going over to Europe, most recently Brian Reynolds. And I think there is a definitive line that extends all the way back from Brian Reynolds to Lamar Hunt. And when he started in 1967 with the Dallas Tornado and what was then the United Soccer Association, one of the predecessors to the NASL, and he started from day one, essentially introducing youth soccer into the North Texas soccer community. And that is when leagues started forming, when clubs started forming, youth soccer essentially got started. And he made it a point, it's my understanding, to make sure that all the players in the Tornado at that point, which was Dundee United from Scotland, got out into the community, did clinics, worked with kids, and everything else. And that legacy has continued throughout the Dallas Tornado days and through FC Dallas, where there are still people from the Dallas Tornado family that are still involved in youth soccer in North Texas, this many years later. And there's no question that is probably the single most enduring legacy. But I will also comment, too, that I think his fingerprints are all over just about everything that happened in NASL and MLS in Texas, too. He was the one who essentially, from what I understand, from talking with people who knew what was going on, was the one who got Ward Lay to essentially put the soccer team in San Antonio that ended up becoming the San Antonio Thunder. I have absolutely no doubts that he was involved in the Houston Hurricane in those days. And even extending it further along, I've had conversations with people who were involved with trying to bring MLS to San Antonio in 2005. And the Lamar Hunt's fingerprints were all over that too. So, he basically has made an enormous impact on the community, on the state, the soccer in the state. I don't think we'd be anywhere close to where we are right now without him.
Yeah,
and he's also
it's interesting.
The first person who built a soccer stadium. Remember, he built.
That's true. That's a great point.
He first one to build it. In 1999, he built one in Columbus.
Now that's a prerequisite, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You can't.
Yeah. If you don't have a stadium, even in USL, if you don't have a stadium plan or you don't have a situation where you can do something well, then you're not going to get very far with your club, either getting into the league in general, but then also the success. So I think it's a great point. I want to ask you guys a kind of bigger picture question, which is, why is it important to chronicle these stories? Dave, Brett, I'll start with you because your archive is so large and you've been doing this for a long time and kind of trying to maintain the video and everything. It's not necessarily easy. So why bother?
Well, that's a good question. Who was it? Henry Ford, who said, history is bunk. He's famous for saying that. He said, I don't care about history. I only care about what's happening right now. If you think about it, sometimes in life, there's some things that are pleasurable, which you only care about at the time you experience them. Like if you eat a good meal, you will enjoy it while you're eating it, but you're not going to look back 10 years later and think, oh, wow, that was a great meal 10 years ago. Well, sports fortunately are different. I mean, at least for me and for many people. You can continue to enjoy sports just thinking about them and reliving great moments in the history of the game. I mean, for me, that was all about video. I mean, I remember when I started my soccer video collection around 1991, I thought if I'm lucky, I'll find maybe 10 or 15 NASL games on video. I ended up finding more than 400, which was just so surprising to me. I mean, some of those games were recorded by the league itself and then were dispersed to various players and coaches when the league went out of business. But most of the games were actually recorded by just folks at home on early VCRs. I mean, of course, in those days, VCRs were very expensive and videotapes were expensive. So it's hard to find people who recorded the games, but fortunately I did. Some people relive the great moments, relive sports by like having autographed pictures, or that never did anything to me. I don't like looking at a picture. I don't care what the person's autograph looks like, and I don't want to just look at some picture of the person. To me, the fun of reliving the sport is to actually see the whole game. And even highlights of a game often kind of miss the significance of the great moments themselves because they don't show the moments in the context of the game itself. So I'm just my personal taste. I like to watch the whole game to enjoy it. People always ask me, like, how often do you go back and watch these games in your collection? By the way, I keep all of my soccer videos, several thousand of them, in a guest room in my house over there, which I refer to as the tomb of soccer history. And some of these games I haven't watched in 10 or 20 years, and I may never watch again. But it's nice to know that they're there, and especially if I can become friends with somebody who played one of the games, I can take the tape out. Or I've made a lot of these games. It's been a great way of getting to know the former players, because if I contact a player who played 20, 30, 40 years ago, and I say, I've got DVDs of games you played in, very often they don't have any tapes of games they played in. And so they're thrilled that somebody like me could come along and offer them a video record of their own games. And so it's been a way that I could develop a rapport with a lot of former players. I suppose, look, I perhaps look at sports differently. I'm sure some people are only interested in what's happening right now. and they don't care about a game that was played as recently as 10 days ago, or let alone 10 years or 40 years ago. But I for whatever reason, I have a different approach. I appreciate watching a game 40 years ago as much as I appreciated watching a game played today. And unfortunately, there are plenty of other people who have that same passion, and I can share that hobby with all these other people. I used to share that passion with people through a website. I kept a list of all my games on a website. I ended up closing that website down about 5 years ago because I felt that so many of the games had now appeared on YouTube, and you can watch so many old games on YouTube. You didn't need to get the game from me. So that was why my website is no longer operating, but I still make copies of the old games available for example, to journalists. If journalists need a game or want to report on, something from the past, I make those games available. And sometimes if, old friends, I'll make a copy of the game available. And as I said, I also still from time to time upload games to YouTube. I'll probably be doing more of that in the future.
Great. We'll definitely look out for that. Yeah, that's awesome. Josh, what drives you? Because not only are you chronicling soccer history that, is difficult to find, you sort of joked before we got on the panel that the site may outlive you and sort of try and hopefully reach its mission one day of chronicling every moment, essentially, of the U.S. Open Cup. Why do what you do, and why this one tournament? Because it's a very specific focus.
Yeah, I started the website started as a radio show. When I was in college, I worked at a radio station, and we had this extra studio, and we just decided, let's sort of similar to like Jason Davis's radio show on XM, like that format of like, we're just talking everything about soccer. If there's a lower division story that's interesting, or if there's anything, like, we talked about it. And we talked about the Open Cup a lot because we thought it was great, and so we were just fans of it and interested in it. And then the more we covered it like a normal tournament, like, to us. And we were sort of in our own bubble of, like, we didn't truly realize how little, how it wasn't really a mainstream tournament to us or to others, but it was to us. And so we got, people reached out to us and were asking us about Open Cup information. And then we started a website company reached out to us. And then that's how the site got started. And I met Chuck Nolan Jr. online, and he had a Open Cup collection of results that he had tracked down, and we sort of put our heads together and we started it. And the more we started talking about it and sort of reminiscing about things that we had read about and stories we had uncovered, we realized, like, nobody is doing this, and we're hyping this tournament, on our radio show and talking about it and giving people all this perspective about what's happening with the tournament. And we're realizing that, like, we don't know anything about what happened, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even, like, and there's no information, no way to find it. And so we kind of took it upon ourselves to do that. And I figured, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And, the Federation wasn't doing it. The USASA didn't have any records. And so we just started chipping away at it. And we're like, well, if somebody's going to do it, we're going to try to do it right. And so we, with Chuck basically laying the foundation with the results that he had, we just kind of started going from there. And we went through, the newspaper archives and, interviewing players and coaches and going through the Hall of Fame. I think Chuck moved 3 pilgrimages to the Hall of Fame, and basically, I think he picked them clean. I don't think there's any Open Cup information we don't have from the Hall of Fame. So I think he even went there when it was, like, in storage in North Carolina too. I think he was very dedicated to just uncovering as much as we can. So we're always uncovering information about it. And I just, whenever people talk about the tournament as it's happening now, we just think, like, man, there's so much of a history, and people don't realize, like, they talk about the Seattle Sounders are about to win their 5th championship, or, Sporting Kansas City about to win their, like, nobody's won 5, but who are these teams that have won 5? Like, nobody knows who these guys are. And so we're trying to tell those stories to people, and, before they get lost, really. I think that's kind of what has happened to a lot of them, especially in that you talked about the NASL, and when the tournament got up to the 1960s and 1970s, it basically, we call that sort of the dark ages of the Open Cup. So it was there were no places to find it, because if there was going to be soccer coverage in a paper, which was pretty minimal to begin with, they weren't going to cover the Open Cup. They were going to cover NASL. So that's why, like, from that late 60s into even into the 90s, like we have like a dark ages of Open Cup media, coverage. So we're trying to fill in those gaps, and I'm kind of down to, we've gotten so many results, but I'm down to like tracking down coaches and players and saying, hey, what do you remember? Or like, I got a 83 Region 3 program that has the bracket from the men's Open Cup that year, that was held. I think it was in Memphis or something like that. It had some Texas teams in it. So I'm basically relying on people like that to help us out to piece this whole thing together.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that with your Texas Soccer Leader interview series that you're running on Texas Soccer Journal this year, you're doing some of that, just telling people, what do you remember? But can you kind of share with us your origin story? And I think it's interesting at how you started to sort of tell these stories that, as Josh said, if we don't, then who will?
Well, I guess, putting Texas Soccer Journal aside and focusing on the history part of it. Frankly, the pandemic has kind of accelerated a move which I had in the back of my mind to basically spend a lot more time in this effort. And I'll tell you, humorously, part of the reason for me to do this, I didn't grow up in Texas. I grew up in Northern California. And so I didn't have really much connection to Texas soccer, honestly. I moved here in 2002, became a day one Dynamo season ticket holder in 2006 when I was living in Houston. That's my connection to soccer in Texas. But part of the reason I did this was that I think it was I started in 2017, but maybe a year before that or something, I actually saw another review for another football book written in Texas. And that immediately just got me started. Okay, well, now here's the 752nd book that's been written about football in Texas, and I've yet to find anything written about soccer. So that became my mantra, that I was going to do something about this, to try to find a way to create it. I don't know that I'm smart enough to have a book in me, but in any event, I wanted to do that. And the pandemic, one of the things that I did in the pandemic is that I lived fairly close to San Antonio. And I knew the San Antonio Thunder existed. I knew they were there when I was following the NASL back in the mid-'70s. But there was virtually nothing about the San Antonio Thunder anywhere. So I made it my mission to track down people who were involved in the franchise to try to get as much of the story out there as I can. And I managed to track down one of the players who, interestingly enough, was the only person who played both years the San Antonio Thunder played and the 3 years the Houston Hurricane played. He's has quite a unique niche in Texas NASL history. His name is Mark Stahl. Mark Stahl.
Oh, okay.
And he's a defender and also the head coach for the San Antonio Thunder. And I spent hours on the phone last year with Don Beatty, who was their main coach for 2/3 of the time that the club existed. And I heard stories and found things that just nobody has ever heard before, about how Bobby Moore got recruited to San Antonio, about how George Best almost played in San Antonio, about and even something as ridiculous as back in those days, they had very small rosters. They played with 15, maximum of 18 player rosters. And they imported these people, most of them from, as I think Dave mentioned, most of them from overseas. But there was one long weekend where the club had a day off, where 3 of his Scottish midfielders decided to go visit Nuevo Laredo. And they came back after they had spent their day down there and found out that their visas would not let them back into the United States. So they literally had to go to Mexico City, fly back to Scotland, get new visas, and come back to the United States. Meanwhile, the Thunder played 2 weeks without essentially a midfield. They were moving defenders up there. They were doing all kinds of crazy things to try to make up for the fact that they had lost a substantial part of their midfield. And at the end of the season, they finished out of the playoffs by 1 point. And it's likely that if those midfielders had been there, they would have been in the playoffs. And I've since found out from talking with the owner or with the coach, who was the last person to see Ward Lay, who was the owner of the Thunder, that if in fact they'd made the playoffs, there's a strong possibility that they would have stayed in San Antonio for another year instead of moving to Hawaii, which they ultimately end up doing. But there are so many stories out there like that, and that have never been told, never been heard. The Bobby Moore story in itself is just a fascinating story that I wrote about on my site. And I'm really now just committed to trying to find more of those. Before, as Josh pointed out, the people that are involved in all these things aren't here anymore.
How do we do that? Because I think that's kind of where I want to close this panel, is like kind of summing up how we continue to find those histories and how we make sure that the stories like that. Now, of course, the team isn't going to want that kind of story to get out necessarily, but those stories of the day-to-day in soccer, and obviously the Striker Texas is going to try and fit in. Like, the whole point of this site is to try and give soccer a platform in the state, but what's it going to take for us to kind of be able to tell those stories well, to actually cover soccer in this country and for us in this state like it's covered in England or Argentina or Mexico or Korea, right? I don't know who wants to go first. If anyone has thoughts, maybe.
I think Dave getting the video archive going is huge. It's something that we've been trying to do with our site as well, and he probably has a bunch of stuff that we don't have either. Like finding, once in a while we'll find there was a 1990 Open Cup game that was on local television somewhere, things like that we just don't have it anywhere. I have it on a VHS tape. I don't have a VHS player, so I need to get one of those again. So it's I know. I probably should just mail them all to you and let you digitize them for me. It's just not on my. I have a huge to-do list, but it's. I think video is huge, but I think also just telling, just like Jeff was saying, telling these stories, finding these stories, and being able to tell them, and I think at the end, maybe on my deathbed, I will finish up the book about the U.S. Open Cup, because I feel like something needs to be written. But I think having sites like the Texas Soccer Journal and sites like that are sort of like regional or specific to a particular state and or area, I think we need more of those, because I think there's so many stories that people care about that are connected to them directly that people would love to hear more about. And if you can tell those stories, you're going to drum up more interest, and people will be more invested in it if they know that there is some history involved in the sport, in the sport that they cover, that this amateur team that they follow down the road, that if you pay attention, then learn about, there was other amateur teams that were in this area that competed in the 40s and 50s, and that people actually did play soccer before 1996, which a lot of people know. So
this is going to be the hardest question of the panel. Go ahead, Dave Brett. Go ahead.
Well, just briefly, the kind of frustrations that I have dealt with, especially with ESPN, for years I tried to get my archive onto ESPN Classic, because that seems like the natural place for it. ESPN has this channel where they devoted to showing historic sports. ESPN Classic was not interested. The program director for ESPN Classic for years was a guy who was not a soccer fan, didn't like the sport, never watched it. He made it very clear, said, look, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. I tried to reach higher ups at ESPN. They would not take or return my phone calls. So ESPN Classic has been a dead end for me. Here's a brief anecdote about the frustration. About 5 years ago, I didn't find, another person found about a minute worth of black and white film of the U.S. national team playing Ireland, and I believe 1924 or 1925. And it just so happened that the United States was actually about to play Ireland in Ireland, like a few months later. So I gave the minute, I sent a link to the minute-long film to the U.S. Soccer Federation. They passed it along to ESPN and said, look, we would love to see this, at least, part of this minute at some point during the broadcast of the U.S.-Ireland match. ESPN said they would show it during halftime, and they had a whole thing prepared. And then apparently, from what I'm told, the on-site producer of the U.S. national team broadcast in Ireland made a game-time decision to show highlights of the first half instead of showing, even though there were no goals scored in the first half, instead of showing the highlights from 1925. So we found this great clip, which would have been perfect, to show USA play in Ireland, it was 80 and 90 years earlier, and they didn't even show it. And so that's the kind of frustration we have. Fortunately, YouTube has become an outlet for this kind of thing. You can put this sort of stuff on YouTube, and you can bypass the people at ESPN. But it is very frustrating because I'd like to see more of this kind of video on actual television, and it's not going to get there until people who are in position to put it there want to see it there.
Yeah, I suppose that as we sort of begin to close this discussion is a good sort of summation in that clearly there are stories that are interesting to almost any soccer fan that are not being told, or that are being told but maybe not being amplified. And so I guess those watching live or on archive, support these sites. Obviously this is the Texas Soccer Summit brought to you by the Striker Texas. We want you to subscribe to the Striker. We want you to enjoy our content. And we're going to be chronicling mostly things that are happening in the present and going forward. But we don't want to do that forgetting about our history. And so projects like the Cup.us, Texas Soccer Journal, Dave Brett's archives, YouTube clips are worth remembering, and I think that it's important that we remember these stories. My toughest question of the day for you gentlemen is to give me a 1-minute summation, a 1-minute final statement. It's tough not because of the task, but because of my time constraint, but we do have to get out at the top of the hour for the next panel. Josh, 1 minute.
Well, I thanks for having me on, and I think that having more of these history panels and discussions, and even just for me, I think getting historians to interact with each other and to because I think we're all sort of maybe in our own research bubble of what we're working on, and it's good to just branch out. And I think the more people like us can share these stories, and maybe more people will reach out to us with have Dave Brett has a VHS tape in their library of an old NASL game. Maybe they'll reach out to him, or maybe somebody knows somebody who played in a Texas U.S. Open Cup game in the 1970s, and they could reach out to me. So I think the more we can work together to try to piece together this soccer history, I think the better it will be for the future.
Jeff, your final thought?
I think that everything has a time where it becomes relevant. And the 2026 World Cup is going to be that time where all of this becomes relevant. And I think that the key for all of us is to continue to put in place all of the building blocks so that when the time comes that new people become interested in the sport, there is information available for them to sample, to learn, to feel with. And I ultimately am very excited that the Striker Texas has gotten started. I mentioned this to Chris and everybody else involved. And I look forward to working with you guys to help translate some of this history and get it to a broader audience that you can provide than I certainly can.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. We really only scratched the surface today. Dave Brett, your final thought?
Yeah, I want to thank you for hosting this panel. I mean, the fact that you're doing this shows that you are interested in the history of the game, and you're willing to make an effort to disseminate that history. I want to emphasize. I also want to thank Josh for bringing up a good point. If anyone watching right now happens to have old film or video from 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s of soccer, and you think that it hasn't been seen, and you think other people would be interested in seeing it, I can act as a clearinghouse. You can contact me on Twitter. I'm Dave Brett 88, one word, DAVEBRETT 88. I had to take Dave Brett 88 because somebody else had just Dave Brett, so I had to add the numbers to it. But you can contact me there, and I can tell you whether what you have is something of real value, and send it to me. I say I'll digitize it, I'll upload it to YouTube, and I will share it with the world. If you don't want to bother doing it, you can put it up on YouTube yourself, but if you don't want to bother doing that, send it to me and I'll do it.
I think that there's a very collaborative nature that all three of you guys would agree is kind of, if people want to reach out, if people want to work on the same project, it seems like those who want to tell these stories, these amazing stories of soccer in Texas and in the United States as a whole, reach out. It seems like a lot of people are trying to piece together the puzzle, and everyone might hold a different piece. So with that, we'd like to thank our panelists, Josh, Jeff, and Dave Brett. And then again, the Cup.us for Josh, Texas Soccer Journal for Jeff, and at Dave Brett 88 on Twitter. We'd also like to thank you for tuning in today and enjoying this panel. You can check out the Striker Texas for a review of the panel and also a written write-up of every single panel that we've had today. Make sure you stay tuned. Next up, it's the secret life of a pro soccer player. What's it really like to be a player? Chris Bills is going to talk with an athlete or two to tell you a little bit about that. And we'll have other panels coming up today on the final day of the Texas Soccer Summit. Take care, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
On behalf of the Austin Soccer Foundation, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Please follow us on social media and let us know how you can join us in giving back to our community through the beautiful game.